Chapter 2 of The Corner House Girls by Grace Brooks Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leanne Fortune. Uncle Peter's Will. Tess and Dot were greatly excited. As they climbed up the long and semi-dark flights to the little flat at the top of the house, they clung tightly to each other's hands and stared round-eyed at each other on the landings. Behind them laboured the tall grey gentleman. They could hear him puffing heavily on the last flight. Dot had breath left to burst open the kitchen door and run to tell Ruth of the visitor. "Oh, Ruthie!" gasped the little girl. "There's a man dead out here, and Uncle Peter's come to tell you all about it." "Why, Dot Kenway!" cried Tess, as the elder sister turned in amazement at the first wild announcement of the visitor's coming. "Can't you get anything straight? It isn't Uncle Peter who wants to see you, Ruth. Uncle Peter is dead." "Uncle Peter Stower?" exclaimed Aggie in awe. He was the Kenway girl's single wealthy relative. He was considered eccentric. He was, or had been, a bachelor, and lived in Milton, an upstate town some distance from Bloomingburg, and had occupied, almost alone, the old Stower homestead on the corner of Main and Willow Streets, locally known as the Old Corner House. "Do take the gentleman to the parlour door," said Ruth hastily, hearing the footstep of the visitor at the top of the stairs. "Dot, go unlock that door, dear." "Aunt Sarah's sitting in there, Ruth," whispered Aggie hastily. "Well, but Aunt Sarah won't bite him," said Ruth, hurriedly removing her apron and smoothing her hair. "Just think of Uncle Peter being dead," repeated Aggie in a daze. "And he was Aunt Sarah's half-brother, you know. Of course, neither her father nor mother was Uncle Peter's father or mother. Their parents were all married twice, and—" "Oh, don't!" gasped the plump sister. "We never can figure out the relationship. You know we can't, Ruth. Really, Aunt Sarah isn't blood-kin to us at all." "Uncle Peter never would admit it," said Ruth slowly. "He was old enough to object, Mother said, when our grandfather married a second time." "Of course, I know," acknowledged Aggie. "Aunt Sarah isn't really a Stower at all. But Aunt Sarah's always said the property ought to come to her when Uncle Peter died." "I hope he has left her something. I do hope so. It would help out a lot," said Aggie, serious for the moment. "Why, yes, it would be easier for us to get along if she had her own support," admitted Ruth. "And we'd save 5 cents a week for peppermints," giggled Aggie suddenly, seeing the little white bag of candy on the table. "How you do talk, Ag," said Ruth admonishingly, and considering herself presentable, she went through the bedroom into the front room or parlour of the flat. Aggie had to stay to watch the cake, which was now turning a lovely golden brown in the oven. The tall grey gentleman with the sharp eyes and beak-like nose had been ushered in by the 2 little girls, and had thankfully taken a seat. He was wiping his perspiring forehead with a checked silk handkerchief, and had set the high hat down by his chair. Those quick grey eyes of his had taken in all the neat poverty of the room. A careful and tasteful young housekeeper was Ruth Kenway. Everything was in its place. The pictures on the wall were hung straight. There was no dust. In one of the 2 rockers sat Aunt Sarah. It was the most comfortable rocker, and it was drawn to the window where the sun came in. Aunt Sarah had barely looked up when the visitor entered, and of course she had not spoken. Her knitting needles continued to flash in the sunlight. She was a withered wisp of a woman, with bright brown eyes under rather heavy brows. There were 3 deep wrinkles between those eyes. Otherwise, Aunt Sarah did not show in her countenance many of the ravages of time. Her hair was but slightly greyed, she wore it crimped on the sides, doing it up carefully in cunning little pigtails every night before she retired. She was scrupulous in the care of her hands. Her plain gingham dress was neat in every particular. Indeed, she was as prim and old-maidish as any spinster lady possibly could be. Nothing ever seemed to ruffle Aunt Sarah. She lived sort of a detached life in the Kenway family. Nothing went on that she was not aware of, and often, as even Ruth admitted, she had a finger in the pie, which was not exactly needed. "I'm Mr. Howbridge," said the visitor, rising and putting out his hand to the oldest Kenway girl, and taking in her bright appearance in a single shrewd glance. On her part, Aunt Sarah nodded and pressed her lips together firmly, flashing him another bird-like look, as one who would say, "That is what I expected. You could not hide your identity from me." "I am, or was," said the gentleman, clearing his throat and sitting down again, but still addressing himself directly to Ruth, "Mr. Peter Stowe's attorney and confidant in business, if he could be said to be confidential with anybody. Mr. Stowe was a very secretive man, young lady." Aunt Sarah pursed her lips and tossed her head, as though mentally saying, "You can't tell me anything about that." Ruth said, "I have heard he was peculiar, sir, but I do not remember of ever seeing him." "You did see him, however," said Mr. Howbridge. "That was when you were a very little girl. If I am not mistaken, it was when this lady," and he bowed to the silent knitting figure in the rocking-chair, "who is known as your Aunt Sarah, came to live with your mother and father." "Possibly," said Ruth hastily. "I do not know. It was one of few events of his life, connected in any way with his relatives, of which Mr. Stowe spoke to me," Mr. Howbridge said. "This lady expressed a wish to live with your mother, and your Uncle Peter brought her. I believe he never contributed to her support," he added slowly. Aunt Sarah might have been a graven image as far as expressing herself upon this point went. Her needles merely flashed in the sunlight. Ruth felt troubled and somewhat diffident in speaking of the matter. "I do not think either father or mother ever minded that," she said. "Ah," returned Mr. Howbridge. "And your mother has been dead how long, my dear?" Ruth told him, and he nodded. "Your income was not increased by her death? There was no insurance?" "Oh, no, sir." He looked at her for a moment with some embarrassment, and cleared his throat again before asking his next question. "Do you realize, my dear, that you and your sisters are the only living and direct relatives of Mr. Peter Stowe?" Ruth stared at him. She felt that her throat was dry, and she could not bring her tongue into play. She merely shook her head slowly. "Through your mother, my dear, you and your sisters will inherit your great-uncle Peter's property. It is considerable. With the old corner house and the tenement property in Milton, bonds and cash in bank, it amounts to approximately $100,000. "But, Aunt Sarah!" gasped Ruth in surprise. "Your Aunt Sarah was really no relative of the deceased." Here Aunt Sarah spoke up for the first time, her knitting needles clicking. "I thank goodness I was not," she said. "My father was a Maltby, but Mr. Stowe, Peter's father, always wished me to be called by his name. He always told my mother he should provide for me. I have therefore looked to the Stowe family for my support. It was and is my right." She tossed her head and pursed her lips again. "Yes," said Mr. Howbridge. "I understand that the elder Mr. Stowe died intestate, without making a will, my dear. he added, speaking again to Ruth. If he ever expressed his intention of remembering your Aunt Sarah with a legacy, Mr. Peter Stowe did not consider it mandatory upon him. But of course Uncle Peter has remembered Aunt Sarah in his will? Questioned the dazed Ruth. He most certainly did, said Mr. Harbridge, more briskly. His will was fully and completely drawn. I drew it myself, and I still have the notes in the old man's handwriting, relating to the bequests. Unfortunately, added the lawyer with a return to a grave manner, the actual will of Mr. Peter Stowe cannot be found. Aunt Sarah's needles clicked sharply, but she did not look up. Ruth stared wide-eyed at Mr. Harbridge. As was his custom with important papers, Mr. Stowe would not trust even a safety deposit box with the custody of his will. He was secretive, as I have said, began the lawyer again. Then Aunt Sarah interrupted. Just like a magpie, she snapped. I know him, the Stowers. Peter was always doing it when he was a young man, hiding things away, afraid a body would see something or know something. That's why he wanted to get me out of the house. Oh, I knew his doings and his goings on. Miss Maltby has stated the case, said Mr. Harbridge, bowing politely. Somewhere in the old house, of course, Mr. Stowe hid the will, and probably other papers of value. They will be found in time, we hope. Meanwhile— Yes, sir? queried Ruth breathlessly, as the lawyer stopped. Mr. Stowe has been dead a fortnight, explained the lawyer quietly. Nobody knew as much about his affairs as myself. I have presented the notes of his last will and testament, made quite a year ago, to the probate court, and although they have no legal significance, the court agrees with me that the natural heirs of the deceased should enter upon possession of the property, and hold it until the complications arising from the circumstances can be made straight. Oh, Aunt Sarah, I'm so glad for you, cried Ruth, clasping her hands, and smiling one of her wonderful smiles at the little old lady. Aunt Sarah tossed her head and pursed her lips, just as though she said, I have always told you so. Mr. Harbridge cleared his throat again and spoke hastily. You do not understand, Miss Kenway. You and your sisters are the heirs at law. At the best, Miss Maltby would receive only a small legacy under Mr. Stowe's will. The residue of the estate reverts to you through your mother, and I am nominally your guardian and the executor. Ruth stared at him, open-mouthed. The two little girls had listened without clearly understanding all the particulars. Aggie had crept to the doorway, the cake now being on the table and off her mind, and she was the only one who uttered a sound. She said, Oh! You children, you 4 girls, are the heirs in question. I want you to get ready to go to Milton as soon as possible. You will live in the old corner house, and I shall see, with the probate court, that all your rights are guarded, Mr. Harbridge said. It was Dorothy, the youngest, who seemed first to appreciate the significance of this great piece of news. She said, quite composedly, Then we can buy some candy, besides those peppermint drops for Aunt Sarah on Saturdays. End of chapter 2, recording by Leanne Fortune.